Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, which has been hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. I'm Chloe McKee and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb. I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on how to develop an efficient grazing strategy. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Liz Genever, Independent Beef and Sheep Consultant. Liz has previously worked for AHDB for 13 years, establishing both the Ram Compare and the Challenge Sheep projects. So the plan of action is that Liz will run through a presentation and then there will be time for questions at the end. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question at any time, then please type your question into the grey box on the side of your screen. If you can't see this box, you may need to click the small orange arrow to open this box up. I can then ask Liz these questions at the end of the presentation. So we've got nearly 200 people registered tonight, so hopefully there won't be any technical difficulties, but please bear with us if there are any. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Liz.
Hello, good evening, everybody. So the plan for the next half an hour or so is to go through these questions. So I think particularly from a grazing strategy perspective, there's so many different ways that we can approach this. So it's really important to start thinking about what do you really want to achieve from doing it. So we'll run through that. What could be your efficient grazing strategy? Again, the bit I really love about grazing strategies is there's multiple ways to get to the end point, and so it's trying to think which one best suits yourself and land and resources. What are the principles? We'll go back to basics for some of that and just talk about really and how you apply those principles. So once they're sort of in your head, then you can apply them to your own situation and farm. And also for those who haven't necessarily started particularly rotational grazing systems, there's just some sort of top tips in terms of where you start and potentially how you extend the work that you're already doing. And then as Chloe mentioned, there's some time for questions at the end. So grazing strategies in my head are, we all love standing in fields and talking about grass, well I do, and forage, but they are in a way of achieving a goal. They're not doing, we have to integrate them into the rest of your farm business. There's no point prioritizing grazing systems if you haven't got your genetics and your health right, and also vice versa. So it's about how you fit that into a system, really. So one of the reasons why we're particularly interested in grass and forage systems is there's a major ability to reduce costs going into those systems. So we're trying to reduce inputs, we're trying to make better use of homegrown grass and forage, potentially reducing feed costs, potentially reducing fertilizer costs if we've got clover and other crops working for us. So we're focusing on it because it has the potential of improving margins by reducing the input costs. There's also a bit I facetiously put part of the gang because at the moment there's a really massive momentum around people who are part of that sort of grazing system. So Twitter has had a big impact on sort of getting people who want to be part of the gang and want to be rotationally grazing or techno grazing, all of those factors. So that although I say it flippantly, is a really important part of grazing systems. It's an element of support network, and if you're encountering a problem, then there's someone that may be able to answer, or that will be supporting you some of those decisions. And also a lot of people have experienced similar problems, so it is important to have that support network around you, but it's also important to ensure that they're just they're challenging your thinking as well. Particularly rotational grazing systems, why we're interested in it, because they have the potential of increasing output per hectare. So particularly when you're in systems where you're comparing and contrasting against arable systems, performance per hectare is really important, particularly from a gross margin perspective. And when you look at sort of grass-based systems, be that in Ireland or New Zealand or Australia, is that one of the main focuses is increasing output per hectare. And for many years, we've really been focused on per head performance. So sometimes it can be a bit of a switch to get to per hectare performance. But again, it is a finite amount of land that we're trying to maximize performance on. It could be that there's other areas of the farm that's down to environment schemes and performance per hectare isn't quite the right driver for that. So it's trying to work out which bits of your farm where you really try and optimize or maximize performance per hectare. So that following on from that is about growing more grass. So there's an element of competition, particularly if people are measuring and monitoring through systems like AgriNet, via plate meters or sword sticks is that we want to get over, doing the higher numbers better. We want to grow 10, 12, doing the world record's 25 tons. So I'm not suggesting people are aiming for that, but there is an element of wanting to grow more. Certainly, we think that probably the UK is averaging sort of anywhere between 6 to 8 tons of dry matter per hectare on a beef and sheep situation. Remembering that grass, when you don't touch it, grows about 4, sort of 3 to 4 tons. So we have a massive potential to increase the amount of grass that we grow by improving how we graze it, fertilizer, nutrients, things like soil pH. However, going the wrong way. The key thing is there's no point just growing it if we're then not going to utilize more of it. So there is a nice balancing act between growing as much as you need, really, so you can maximize utilization. And that is the bit that's probably the real driver in terms of profitability on grass and forage systems, which is the utilization rate. And so probably, again, rough figures, with under a set stocking situation, we're probably utilizing about 50% of grass that's grown. When we're moving towards more controlled sort of paddock grazing or rotational grazing, we're heading to sort of 70-75% type range. Really, really difficult to measure, to be fair. But again, generally, the more controlled that grazing system, the more you're utilising. And so that's what is a really important factor. It's not, you don't just have to grow more. It's important that that utilisation increases at the same time. There's a big drive also at the moment to sort of marketing as pasture fed. And so that's again why some people are looking down grazing systems to be able to market their stock differently. Resource use efficiency, do you mean it's a different term for what we've just sort of talked about? So how do you make the most of what is being grown on your farm? Generally on grassland farms it's grass, but also where can we fit in forage crops or different ways of sort of conserved feed? Is there other options that make the best use of those resources? And thinking about, I mentioned it before, but clover and all of those factors, we also need to think about how we can make better use of them as well. And I think going forward that we already are being asked, and that will only increase in terms of to be more efficient, which means that ratio between inputs and outputs. So I think as a grass and forage system, we have a great advantage because because of the cost reduction element of trying to reduce inputs while maintaining or increasing output. As mentioned, fewer inputs. Another thing that's becoming really commonly talked about recently is improved soil health. We generally believe or perceive that grassland soils is okay because it's generally got grass on top of it all the time. Some previous work from AHDB suggested that sort of 20-30% of fields do struggle in terms of soil structure. So it is something to think about, and there's a big interest in sort of soil biology and how we can start measuring that. Really good indicator is earthworms, and how can grassland and other things sort of really start to improve soil health and potentially being included in arable rotations to do that. And I put animal performance last, not because it's least important, but because sometimes actual individual animal performance isn't necessarily benefited from intensifying grazing systems, but actually production per hectare is. So it's always if we want individual animal performance to be maximised, sometimes intensive grazing isn't necessarily the answer. There is sometimes a trade-off as they compete more for grass, but it's certainly being aware of what are your targets and how do they sort of play off one another is quite an important thing to think about. But we'll come on to animal performance in a bit. So here we've got this sort of really simplistic view of sort of grazing systems, and it's really important to go a bit back to basics because there's a huge range of sort of phrases that are chucked out at the moment. So if we have a situation where you basically chuck the stock in a field at the beginning of the grazing season and pull them out at the end of the grazing season, you've done nothing with it, that is classically set stocking. And if you're sort of, the image on the left-hand side is the sort of more traditional sort of continuous grazing where you are doing some active management. You might be shutting a bit of that field off. You might be increasing stock on that field for certain times of year. You are managing a sward height to a degree, and you're trying to keep it within sort of an optimum range. but you are managing it to a certain degree, and that's classically called continuous grazing systems. The next step up is then sort of rotational grazing, where those animals are moving around a series of, could be paddocks, could be fields, it could be every few days, it could be every week, it could be based on a time, it could be based on sward heights, but there is a movement of animals around a series of fields. And generally, if you're moving them less frequently than once a week, then it's starting to be not quite rotations. But anyway, so it is a relatively frequent movement of animals through a series of fields or paddocks. And then the one on the extreme right is more sort of what you would be thinking of, more paddock type systems. And that is sort of more intensive grazing systems where you're moving animals more frequently through a series of paddocks generally, but again can be fields. And that is more management intensive and has higher requirement for infrastructure, but that is where you're going to be growing more grass and potentially utilising more grass. The sort of other phrases that are coming out at the moment are things like mob grazing, tall grass grazing, techno grazing. So techno grazing is basically a form of paddock grazing, and that techno system just refers to the type of kit that you're using to set that up, but similarly quite dependent on fencing, water troughs, and investing in that infrastructure. Mob grazing tends to be where you're putting in relatively high numbers of animals into a relatively small area, and the grass tends to be quite long. Works really well for cattle, cows particularly, or older cattle. Doesn't work as well for sheep and younger calves. And also now being referred to a bit more for tall grass grazing, and people are using it to build up organic matter in soils where that is a limiting factor. So why have I gone through all of them is that actually it's you need a range of them. On a lot of beef and sheep systems, you might not use just one, you might use a range of them over the year, and it depends on what you're trying to achieve and the class of stock you've got. And I suppose in the various conversations I have with farmers in terms of measuring grass or putting fences up and all of that stuff, it is really important to ask yourself, how do you wish to spend your time? If you're really enthusiastic about grazing, you will put fences up. If you're not entirely bothered, then don't beat yourself up because you're not going to be a fencer. However, grass and forage is the key driver, or utilisation of grass and forage is a key driver to improve margins. And as sort of different questions are asked of beef and sheep systems, there will be a general movement towards that more intensive grazing system. And a lot of it comes with confidence as well. So generally, I reckon it takes 2 to 3 grazing seasons for people to become confident. And that's partly because to know where fences go, and also to experience a range of weather conditions and sort of work out what happens when it all goes wrong generally. You can sort of super prime that, but generally it does take a couple of years to get confidence in those grazing systems. So if in the future we need to be thinking of more intensive grazing systems, we need to start now to get that confidence built up in a wide range of beef and sheep farmers. And we'll come back to it in a bit, but when is a good time to use the approach? So for example, some people would be using sort of continuous grazing, around lambing time with using lambs. So when young lambs, so to try and avoid social stress, they'd be using continuous grazing type systems. They then might move to rotational grazing as those lambs get older, or they may wait till those lambs are weaned and then those weaned lambs are moved on to a rotation. So you can select or pick and choose which system is most appropriate for what you're trying to achieve with that class of stock. So I'm just going to run through the principles and then I'll go through them in a bit more detail. So there's 6 of them really, and it is about, first one is rest and recovery. And the reason why we're all a little obsessive about rotational grazing systems is that they are designed to allow that grass to have a rest period and allow it to be recovered from an intensive grazing period. And that's what helps that grass grow more, because it has a rest period. It allows it to build up root reserves, and then it does a job for you, and then you graze it off again. You need to think about grazing pressure. So a lot of grazing systems work by having, and if you go and see any of the spring block dairy systems, they have really high grazing pressure for a relatively short amount of time during the day. They move on to the next paddock at the night. So we need to think grazing pressure. But again, we'll talk about that in a second. Aim for the simpler the system, particularly if you're starting to run rotational grazing systems, the simpler or the fewer number of groups you have, the easier it is. So think about how do you simplify that system, and that generally involves similar lambing dates, similar calving dates, as similar as possible groups, or can you add groups together to sort of build them up? So how can you simplify the number of groups you've got and the groups you have to manage? Key thing, prioritising the best grazing for the most productive class of stock. Sounds relatively simple, but you still see people who are prioritising not quite in that order. And we're really fortunate within beef and sheep systems is that we tend to, at several points of the year, have dry animals that can do a really good job for us to clean out pastures and to help sort of bring certain areas back into control. So it links into the next point, which is it is generally better to try and if it feels like grass is getting away from you, it is important to try and maintain quality of much of that grazing platform as possible, and that might mean that you might have to sacrifice some fields that they might get away from you, but part of it is having a plan of how to get them back, and we'll talk about that later on. And then nitrogen fertiliser to boost yields. And I think our attitude to nitrogen fertiliser has to change, partly because I think future pressure means that we won't quite be using as much. Obviously clover is important, but we can use nitrogen quite strategically to boost growth at certain times of the year. So how can we use it to sort of reduce our feed bills, I suppose. So this is the principle that, if you've been to one of my talks before, you would have seen this graph. So this is an image that basically tries to illustrate what happens within that grazing plant. It sort of is what's happening with perennial ryegrass. And what happens is you graze it down, you remove all the leaves. It then takes time for that first, second and third leaf to emerge. And by the time the third leaf emerges in a perennial ryegrass, as the fourth leaf emerges, a leaf dies away. So if you open up a sward and see lots of dead leaves at the bottom, it's because that cycle has happened. So there's loads of leaves sort of decaying, so dying and then falling into the base of the sward. The other thing of why rotational grazing system works and why we want to be grazing at sort of 2.5, 3 leaf stage when that grass has had enough time to recover is it also builds up root reserves. So not only are these root reserves what is then fueling the production of those grass leaves when basically animal grazes off, that's also the sugars that's capturing the carbon in the atmosphere and is what is the start of carbon sequestration. Basically the roots store the glucose and the sugars from photosynthesis, and that's generally is used by the plant but also leaks out into the soil and is what is used by soil microbes to then improve soil biology. So it's quite an important element to build that root reserve up. And why we tend to see that we've got 20% more grass in rotational grazing systems is because you're working within this cycle and you're allowing that grass to recover, put its leaves up, get its full solar panel back in, put root reserves back in, and then you come through and graze it again and the cycle continues. The bit to remember is that the process will vary depending on soil temperature, moisture. So in terms of in the winter time, it takes probably 30 days for a leaf to emerge. So that whole cycle takes 90 days. So if you want grass at lambing time, you can't graze that field. You have to have a 90-day gap between when you last graze it and if you want grass at lambing time. In May, June time, that cycle can happen in anywhere between 15 to 21 days. So that cycle will vary depending on what's happening within the environment. And that's why when grass starts to grow, it can grow very rapidly because this process is just increased as the soil temperature, moisture, everything is right. Excuse me. So the next one is grazing pressure. Again, similarly, the term that we use quite a lot is called residual, and basically that means the amount that's left behind. And that's the element that can be used. And again, if you go and see any spring block dairy systems, they are in terms of 1,500 kilos of dry matter per hectare, which equates to about 4 centimetres. They are religious in terms of their need to get to hit those residuals. Within a beef and sheep world, we do have some flexibility, as it will partly be determined by the speed of grass in front of us, and also what the priority for that class of stock is. So for example, for weaned lambs, we might actually leave that residual slightly higher, so we might leave more behind, but that's because we have a class of stock that's following those lambs and tidying up those paddocks behind them. So we do have some flexibility in the amount that is being left behind, as long as we have a plan of how we are going to reset that field, be it a dry between a group of cull ewes or between thin sheep, or whatever happens to be moving through those paddocks after those lambs. Or it could be that you shut up certain periods and you're going to do a late silage cut or deferred grazing, or it's about having a plan of what you're going to do to try and reset that field. But there is also examples where if that people become quite preoccupied with getting that residuals, and it is actually going to be affecting stock performance because you're asking them to eat too far into the sward where there's not enough green leaf, therefore not enough energy. The other thing is it actually affects how quickly the grass recovers afterwards. So if you basically removed all of its leaf, it will take longer for its first leaf, second leaf, and third leaf to come through. So you also will have an impact on its ability to recover and to return to grazing. So again, in drier times, it might again be useful to leave a bit more leaf about, so then the grass recovery rate is greater. And that's what you started to see, particularly last year, the year that was, is that as fields were grazed shorter and shorter and shorter as grass struggled, it just took longer and longer for that grass to recover once the rain started coming, because it had to work from such a low base. And I suppose it's part of the reason why generally rotational grazing systems last 2 to 3 weeks longer in sort of as you head into dry spells, partly because you're carrying much more grass, but also you're giving chance for that. I suppose as you move off that field, it's getting a bit of a chance to recover rather than just being eaten into all the time. So bear with me for a second. So along the bottom is complexity. So as we move left to right, the theory being is the complexity of how well you manage, or that group of stock is to manage within a grazing system, in my opinion, but please feel free. So in terms of easiness, you would generally think dry stock, be that ewes or cows, are really simple to manage within a rotational grazing system. They've got relatively low requirements, to mean maintenance plus a little bit depending on condition, but really simple to manage and can be quite a big group of animals to sort of do a job for you. Growing and finishing cattle, they have different requirements. They have higher energy requirements than those dry stock, but again, they're relatively simple group of animals, and can be varied. Their numbers can be varied quite easily, so you can pull animals out if you require or add to them, because you don't have to pair them up or anything. So again, simple-ish system, plus most cattle can be run behind a single electric fence wire, if you need to. Weaned lambs, again, relatively simple, because again, similar requirements, can be a bit more challenging to keep behind electric fence, but mob mating groups, so if you've got large groups of whether it's topping or bulling, and so again it's back to the mentality of having a large group that you just move around through one rotation rather than having multiple groups all over the farm. The only challenge with that is that they do have quite high requirements, because again you're sort of flushing them or trying to maintain nutrition over that mating period. Sort of ewes with older lambs can also sort of they are complex-ish, but again can be worked really well into rotational grazing systems. Young calves would be similar to them in terms of more challenging in terms of actually getting them to graze well, rather than actually manage them as a group, but yeah, it's to do with really how well they're grazing. Ewes with young lambs are becoming a bit more complex, just because of the sort of potentially the social stress. I know lots of people who do rotationally graze lambs from a relatively young age, some that have tried that will never do it again. So it does depend on an element of how used to the ewes are to moving, and also the quality of the feed in front of them. But again, it wouldn't be necessarily the class of stock I would start with, which is using young lambs, until that confidence is up. And then probably the most complex system you see is when you generally pedigree breeders and they have multiple topping and bulling groups, and they need to keep so generally bulls apart, but they want to maintain rotation. So you end up with lots and lots of groups with lots of rotations, and it just becomes quite complex. So completely understand why it needs to be done in terms of parentage, but again, wouldn't be the area that I would start with in terms of trying to sort of get an understanding of grazing systems. So that just sort of gives you an idea of classes of stock that are quite sort of where you would start. And if you are struggling with certain groups, it might help you realise because they're quite a complex group to manage because of their requirements or the sort of social element of them. Oh, and that one is untrained stock. So that's anything that just likes going through electric fences. And so there is some guidance. There's a better returns program plus document on electric fencing, and within that there is some guidance about how you can train stock to electric fence, and it is definitely worth investing time before they encounter it to make sure they are respectful of it, and ensuring that a common factor is earths, in terms of not enough earth and power and all of those things, but the BRP guide does go into a bit more detail about that. So then this is in the reverse. So this is about prioritising stock. So it comes back to that point of you've got to prioritise the animals that are in terms of requirement. So anything coming up on the right is, in my opinion, has the sort of priority class of stock that needs to be that sort of top of the tree in terms of what do I put through a system first. Used with lambs, just generally high requirement in terms of maintenance for those ewes, particularly in early lactation. And then as lambs start to graze, they have, again, a high requirement for quality grass. Wean lambs would come in as well into that group, and then growing and finishing cattle would also be in that area. Again, it's really dependent on the sort of energy requirement and their requirement for green leaf. And that's why they're up there. Young calves would be again in that group. Probably quite close as well is animals gaining body conditions, particularly, so we could think about thin ewes post-weaning, and then all cows that are also prioritising those slightly thinner cows still feeding calves. So then again, so they're reasonable requirement for energy. Cows with calves would come in then as well. Ewes around tupping, again, depending on what their body condition score is. Again, they would be reasonable priority, but again, if the body condition score and if they've been managed well to weaning and then post-weaning, that priority is dropping down a little, but still reasonable. Again, similar cows and heifers around bulling, and then dry stock would be probably a bit further, more extremely on the left, and then fat dry stock would be a bit more on the left. So you can again try and pick and choose the groups that you can prioritize stock for, and there's some, as you would have seen, some really successful leader follower systems where you push through them priority stock through those fields first, and then even one or two classes of stock are following up and just tidying up the paddocks. And again, sometimes that the followers are in every now and again because it's just losing quality, or there is it's like a continuous system. So again, it's variable depending on what you need that class of stock to do, and really prioritize for your farm what is the most profitable class of stock, and they're the ones that get the best, and generally it's ewes and lambs, followed closely by finishing and growing cattle. So, and like when I went to New Zealand a few years ago, and we were sort of expecting everything to look beautiful and like everything to be perfect and everything to be like Sward heights nailed, and then very quickly learned that actually the key of a grazier is to not necessarily for everything to be perfect, but to have a plan in your head about what you're going to do to get it back if you do lose quality. And so this is a random assortment of pictures, but the sort of top left is suggesting that you're starting to get sort of stem build up and quality is declining. There might be quite a lot of green leaf in the bottom, and you're happy that aesthetically it looks not particularly great, but they're still being really well fed. Alternatively, you can start shutting up, select a section or some of that field, all of that field for a deferred grazing system. So you could potentially using it with cows later in the year, or use again by allocating that feed back to them at a certain point of the year. And that strategy will depend on where you are in the year. So it could be sort of from sort of late summer onwards, a really good strategy to then have something to put dry stock on later in the autumn. Again, the silaging is an option. depending on the amount and whether it's your own kit and whether it's worth getting the contracts in and all that. Now, all things to factor in, and whether you need that silage or whether it's better to put it in a deferred system so you don't have the cost of making silage to then put it out again. The middle picture at the bottom is actually a sort of a deferred grazing system plus bales. So in the winter, that's a sacrifice field that the cows will be moved through, and the bales of silage are already placed in that field sort of midsummer. So in some situations, they're made in the field and then left in the field to be grazed later in the year. And then the one which is bottom right is a system used quite a lot by the dairy sector on sort of pre-mow grazing. So they'll go into fields and sort of mow them and then allow the cows back in, and then do some sort of controlled grazing to try and encourage them to eat it down. And that's just a way of resetting, but without the waste of topping and then letting the toppings lie on the ground. It's not always conducive necessarily to beef and sheep systems, but it is a strategy that's used quite extensively within the dairy sector. The other thing to think about is using nitrogen as a supplement. So thinking about, we use nitrogen to grow grass, and generally it's significantly cheaper using nitrogen than it is buying feed in, as long as you're applying it to the right type of grass and the right time of year. So generally nitrogen has an active it promotes growth of around about 60 days. It will vary depending on the time of year and the types of grasses, as I mentioned. And generally you have a 10 to 15 kilos of dry matter response to every kilo of nitrogen you put on. Again, if you're doing it in winter, you won't get that. And if you're doing it in sort of mid-spring, that response rate may be higher. But it's quite a nice way to think about how you can use nitrogen to boost feed if you think that, to boost grass if you think grass growth is declining. Obviously, by the time you get into a drought and there's no green leaf, the application of nitrogen is not going to do very much. But it could be that you're sort of preempting an element of that. And that's where measuring grass comes into its own in terms of predicting when and if a deficit is coming. It also is being used more and more to sort of late applications, sort of August time application of nitrogen is to actually build up grass covers, so the amount of grass going into the autumn, thinking that from the 1st of October roughly, the amount of grass on farm only ever goes down. So it's trying to build that number up to the beginning of October to then allow a gentle decline through the winter. So again, it's not necessarily thou shalt never use nitrogen, but it's just using it in a very more strategic approach than just whacking on 30 kilos in March, because that's what you do. So in terms of where do we start? So, and then I suppose it's as ever ask a question back, which is where do you want to be? And what is very common when people start particularly rotational grazing or focusing on grass and forage is all of a sudden they need a hell of a lot more stock, and that has a capital cost. And there's various ways that you could, which means you don't necessarily have to own that stock, but you have to be prepared that you will need more stock. Things will have to change, or potentially more land going into arable crops, for example, or less rented in land or things like that. But there will relatively quickly, a plan has to be made in terms of how you will deal with that extra grass that's being grown. But before we get too carried, well, there's a bit about vision. So where do we want to be, but sort of where are we now? And so what are the current pinch points of your system? And as I said before, is that just focusing on grass and forage per se is interesting. However, to how it fits in terms of your entire grazing system is more useful, or your entire system. So are you using the best grass in the best way, for example? So do you tend to be in a place that's dry in July? So actually having everything down to just grass may not be the right thing. So actually, could you put in different crops that solve that problem? Do your winter ground conditions, are they a limiting factor? And how, so thinking about how you're going to get through winter, are the options to move stock off, or those sort of factors. What is your current performance off grass? Do you mean it is an element that can be quite challenging to monitor performance at grass, but what are you currently doing now, and what do you think you should be doing? The infamous stocking rate, so what is the livestock units per hectare? Again, where are you now? Where could you be? And the proportion of grass and forage in the diet. I speak to a lot of people who go, oh, yeah, I want to do more from grass. And actually, when you look at it, they're actually 90+% of the diet is already coming from grass and forage. So it's not necessarily focusing on what the animals are eating, it's focusing on how many animals are there and what is their performance as well. But absolutely fundamental, which is go and see what other people are doing, because that's where a huge range of farmers now are doing really interesting grazing systems, not just rotation, but sort of really thinking about how their grazing systems are fitting into their systems and vice versa. And definitely, I particularly like going to see sort of springbok dairy systems, or just a real range of systems. It doesn't have to be just sheep or just beef. It's just trying to get into the head of people who are managing grass and forage differently. Other things to think about, which is, I think, as I've sort of alluded to, which is you identify an easy group, and that's could be growing cattle, it could be weaned lambs. And for a lot of the people I've spoken to recently, which is all grass wintering, which is this sort of 100-day paddock system that takes use through the winter, is where they started in the idea that they can manage grass. Because what's interesting about that is it doesn't go wrong very quickly, because yes, you can have wet days, and yes, it gets quite muddy, but grass doesn't get away from you because it's a relatively low growth period. So you sort of start off with the same-ish amount of grass that you end up with. So it's a relatively simple way to start. And again, similarly, they have quite simple requirements as a big group. And then you identify a block or groups of field that can be used, and some people already have field boundaries that make it really easy to rotate round. Some very simple through like a fence line through the middle of the field can fit in, and a lot of people I also know started with putting a fence line through a field and having them group in one side one week, and then they move them the next side. The next week they move them to the other side. Really simple, but it is the start. So it is this idea that the optimum is probably for beef and sheep, well, for weaned lambs, maybe 2 to 3 days-ish moves, maybe for cattle 3 to 5 days, but it is generally more frequently than once a week. Big thing generally is water. We've touched a bit about fencing, but water is fundamental in terms of a barrier to why people aren't fencing fields differently. There's a variety of techniques, so spokes from that water tank, or the various tanks that sort of are dragged along the ground now. There's lots of different ways, and generally the idea is that if the person wants to do it, they will find a solution to making water available in those fields. But it is also a very common excuse for why those fields are not being grazed differently. And that element of, again, a slightly facetious comment at the end, but it is about building confidence, and then generally the addiction starts, and then you can start putting fence lines in all different places, and then it's trying to then counter that and ensuring that the system is as simple and as effective as possible. The question I hate is, what should my stocking rate be? And so very unscientifically, if you're thinking about, if you've got a field and you would normally stock it with 25, but you're starting to split it into sections, you're still trying to probably maintain the stocking rate you would have over your entire field, but you're actually increasing the stocking density. You're putting them into a smaller area, and probably you also just need to add a bit. So, and that's very poor, I know, as advice, but in reality you also want to start with a group of stock that you can add and take away very easily. So that's why ewes and lambs are not the place I would start a rotation or system with, because they're just really difficult. If the grass suddenly gets away or the growth drops, the ability to manipulate that group size is very difficult. The other way is obviously to match supply and demand. And so for a weaned lamb, we roughly say it needs about 1 kilo of dry matter intake per day, around 30 kilos. And so if grass is growing at 40 kilos of dry matter per day, then that will hold 40 lambs with no real change in. That's, again, not particularly scientific, because that assumes that the pasture cover will stay the same and the utilisation is very high. But it sort of gets you the idea of what we need to be thinking in terms of how much does an animal need to eat, or a group of animals need to eat, how much is being grown and is available in that field, and that's how we start to plan what those sort of stocking rates should be. And monitoring growth can help make decisions. And GrassCheck GB is funded alongside, well, you can see the logos in the top right hand side, but AHDB, QMS, HEC are funding the beef and lamb farms involved in that project. It's being run by Centre for Innovation and Excellence in Livestock with the support of AFBI and Rothamsted. And what they're doing is there's 27 farms across England, Wales and Scotland, 5 in each, that are measuring grass growth and then feeding back weekly that information to produce a graph is like the one that you see in front of you. It's published weekly in Farmers Guardian, and also available on the website that you can see in the top left-hand corner. And what we're seeing, what's interesting in that is you start to see the dairy farmers being in green in the top line, and beef and sheep farmers being sort of tracking them, but just a bit lower, driven by probably nitrogen, also possibly grass types. But you can see that the first dip that we sort of saw middle of May was actually because it was dry. And then the second dip we saw was perhaps because it was wet and cold. And so you can see this, how grass growth is really reflecting what's happening in terms of the weather in that situation. So what's nice about this system is this is the first time at scale for beef and sheep that we are actually getting grass growth information from across the country that can help people make decisions in terms of what their stocking rate could be, and if they measure their own grass, perfect. If they don't, then at least they have some ideas of what that grass might be growing if they check on the farm nearest them. This is an infamous, apologise for the level of detail, but this is, I generated this a while ago as a sort of a ready reckoner because I get asked the question about stocking rates quite a lot. So this allows us to sort of think about what stocking rate means. So if we just go back a section and just say actually beginning of July, beef and sheep farms were growing about 60 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. So that's where we are at the moment. So when we, so this, just to explain, so the various columns, so the first one is livestock units per hectare, and then we've got demand in kilos per dry matter per hectare, what the U's and U per hectare number would be, and the U's per acre number would be. And so when we're looking at systems that we're sort of on average across the year, we're running between sort of 10 to 12 U's per hectare. So that means across the entire year, we're looking at a sort of demand of anywhere between sort of 22 to 26 kilos of dry matter per hectare. But as you can see from that graph, it varies. So it peaks now, doesn't it? And then during the winter, it won't grow as much. So on average across the year, we're looking around about that number. And then similarly, we have so if we're thinking about suckler cows, that's like 1.5-ish cows per hectare, 3 to 3.5 growing cattle per hectare. But obviously we're now in a system where we're talking 50, 60 kilos plus. So again, if we're focusing down there, actually currently the ewes per hectare, sort of the stocking density for these animals needs to be a lot higher to reflect that grass growth. And so that is why if we need ways of adjusting stocking rate, and how we generally do it is we shut up areas for hay, silage, and that's how we control this this sort of explosion of growth that tends to happen during the spring and into the summer. So I'm not sure that's any easy, but it's just to reflect that we have to think slightly differently of what is the overall stocking rate for that farm across the year, and that might include silage land and it will include wintering potentially, versus what is the stocking rate we need to use at this time of year to maximise the utilisation of that grass. Okay, final slide. So we need to think about what that grazing strategy needs to achieve. So and that allows us to then start to think about what are the tools and the techniques that we need to apply to get to that outcome that you want. So are you chasing output per hectare? Are you chasing animal performance? What are you trying to achieve from that grazing system? And then you can work out how those principles I went through applies to your system and to your situation. Easier said than done, but have a go. And it is potentially as simple as putting a fence line up, but please choose an easy class of stock. I think I've said that several times. And go and see other people's systems is a really important part, and develop a support network. So AHDB does have a few grazing groups around the country. There's other grazing groups, and for example, British Grassland Society will have discussion groups as well. Twitter seems to be a really good hotspot of activity on grazing groups and people sharing information and experiences in terms of grazing. So again, that's something to look out for, and also have a look at GrassCheck GB. Thank you very much. A lot of the detail and the sort of theory and all the things I went through was contained within this book that's available on the AHDB website.
Thanks, Liz. So while I'm waiting for some questions to come up, I'd just like to remind you all that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available to watch back on our YouTube channels. We also have some other Better Returns programme manuals which may be of interest. So we've got Improving Pasture for Better Returns, the Planning Grazing Strategies, as Liz has mentioned, and there are also the Recommended Grass and Clover List Handbook, which is very useful if you're planning a reseed. These are on our website and they're also available in hard copy. So I'll have a look at the questions. So the first one, Liz, can you effectively rotationally graze sheep during the winter months?
So in terms of the best way to approach that is with the sort of alluded to the all-grass wintering system, which tends to start, it can vary around, it can either start during or before tupping and actually sheep are tupped on that system, or after tupping, after the rams come out. And it's based on sort of this idea of 100-day paddocks, as in the sheep move through them in from that period, from 100 days from that date all the way through to probably set stocking at lambing. A lot of the original work that was done on all grass wintering was done on systems that were outdoor lambing, but it can be worked really effectively into, they can move off grass into sheds if necessary, but it's just a way of sort of rationing the winter grass quite effectively, but also allowing that ground to have some recovery time. So what we're trying to avoid is when sheep can just range over the entire area and then the grass has no time to recover. So yeah, all grass wintering, again, there's a better returns program plus document on all grass wintering that takes you into a lot of that detail in terms of how it can be done. But yeah, it's a really nice system and particularly quite good for if you've got problem fields which have sort of lost quality. It's a really nice way of tidying them up and getting better quality grass going into the next spring.
Thanks, Liz. And with mob grazing, what sort of utilisation can you achieve, and does it have a negative effect on parasite burdens?
So mob grazing, so in terms of the mob grazing that's sort of being used by quite a lot of people to sort of to increase organic matter. So the real objective for that is they're actually not really utilising more than about 30% of it. So they are trampling some of it. Some of it's being left to regrow, and then they're actually eating about 30% of it, because a lot of it's to do with feeding the soil biology. So you actually want more of that vegetation to be trampled or in contact with the soil, so then earthworms and other things can take it in. So it's not in conflict with the sort of a lot of the grazing systems that I'm used to seeing are sort of the ones that vary from about 15 centimetres high to about 4 centimetres. But tall grass grazing is quite a different ethos, and it's to do with what is your objective. If your objective is very much about soil biology and maximising organic matter returns into that soil, then mob grazing can be very useful. As I mentioned earlier, it's quite useful for cows and older cattle. I haven't seen it work as well for sheep, just in terms of quality, but it's a bit about what is your objective for that field, and in that situation, the cattle are doing a job for you, as well as hopefully growing on that material. In terms of from a parasite perspective, because we generally think the parasite tends to be relatively close to the soil, but can move up and down the plant depending on the moisture that's sort of available for those larvae to migrate. With tall grass grazing, which is what we'd sort of think of about as mob grazing, the parasites, you potentially are allowing the animals to eat areas of that plant that hasn't got parasites on it. So it could potentially reduce the parasite burden that those animals are taking in. But the sort of idea sometimes of sort of more traditional rotational grazing, when you're sort of going in at say 10 to 12 centimetres and coming out at 4, there is also a slight risk that you're actually going to be returning back to that field just in time for those parasites to be hatching, to be taken in. So you've left it, you've grazed it, you've come back after 21, 28 days, and the larvae are in a perfect situation to be consumed again. But the benefit you have in a rotational grazing system is those animals have access to really high quality feed. So that does help them in terms of an immune response to that larval challenge. And you've still got, doing a lot of that, the parasites will still be quite close to the soil. So the harder you ask them to eat into the ground or eat the grass to the ground, the more chance they are to pick up larvae. So if you are using systems where you're getting sheep or cattle to eat higher covers, you potentially are reducing parasites. You're not eliminating it, and it's still worth monitoring fecal egg counts and all in terms of growth rates, but you are potentially reducing that intake.
Thanks, Liz. This person says they have a couple of fields in a valley which have been left to grow very long to seed this summer and have hardly been grazed. Is it now better to top them and leaving the dead seed stalks to rot down, or leave it as standing hay for grazing down over winter?
If it's relatively sort of quite clean, as in it's not already building up quite a lot of dead material, then it's probably best to leave it and graze it, and sort of either strip graze it or block graze it in the sort of autumn into the winter. There, in terms of utilisation and sort of cleaning out that those fields, it's strip grazing would do a really nice job, and cows would be a really great sort of, they'd do a really good job on that as long as they were sort of allocated the right amount of feed. The worst thing we can do is just allow them to roam wherever, and therefore there'll be sort of poor utilisation. But if you think about, particularly from a suckler cow perspective, that standing hay crop is going to be similar to what you would be feeding them or aiming to feed them in the shed if they were sort of a spring calving suckler cow during the winter. So it can work really effectively, but it does depend on having some sort of control over how much they're allocated, both in terms of so they don't end up getting too fat, but also so you improve the utilisation of that field. But it does, at the moment, if there is a lot of dead already building up, you just probably need to do it earlier, because if there's a loss of grass, and to top it and not remove it would be a nightmare to then deal with, really. So you'll have, whatever you do, you have to probably, and if there's a bulk of material, you'll have to remove it, whether that's in the belly of an animal or with silage or some other means. Don't just top it, I think, is my top tip.
Thanks, Liz. Do you know what a typical nitrogen application per hectare would be on a 30-day rotation at this time of the year?
Well, that's a nice question. So a lot of within RB209, so the nutrient management guide, there'd be the recommendations is about 30 to 40 kilos of N per rotation. So that's what. So it's relatively small applications, little and often, but that has to be done with knowledge of how much grass. So I know this year a lot of people have got a lot more grass than, well, particularly compared to last year. So I think that nitrogen application needs to be done in the knowledge of actually what's the future grass look like, and am I just creating more of a surplus, or am I going to a period where actually I need to boost grassland production? So I wouldn't just, oh, I've just taken the cows out or sheep out and I need to put the fertilizer on. You might need to, but are you just promoting a surplus, or is it from a requirement?
Thanks, Liz. On older permanent pasture with less productive weed grasses, they tend to go strandy and become less palatable. Should we just ignore this when looking at residuals?
So if you're thinking, when we're assessing fields for residuals, we're tending to trying to ignore those straggly bits, because that isn't obviously what we're trying to look at. How evenly, firstly, we're looking at how evenly that field's been grazed, and if there is lots of straggly bits, we have to ask the question of why there is. So is it that they've just avoided them because they're unpalatable? Is it because it's where they dung and urine sites were previously? Is it was because they've been given a too big an area and then had to be there for longer, so they haven't grazed it tight enough or well enough? So there's a few questions to ask, and then in terms of understanding residuals, then I wouldn't include those straggly bits, but I would think about why those straggly bits are there. The other thing to think about from a permanent pasture perspective is that plate meters tend to underpredict how much kilos of dry matter are there by about 10%, because there tend to be more tillers present in those sort of pastures. They tend to be thicker, denser pastures. So that's another thing to think about, is that the plate meter might tell you one number, but actually there's probably more feed in that field than the plate meter is telling you.
Thanks, Liz. And if you take residuals too low, so say 3 centimetres with using lambs, how will this affect the length of time for suitable regrowth in summer?
So again, it depends a bit on moisture content and all of that, but yeah, you're looking probably, I'm guessing probably a week you're probably going to affect it by, depending on by just that extra bit of recovery in the summertime, because that's how the sort of leaf turnover is taking about a week, so it's you sort of adding another week onto that recovery time. But it would be really dependent on what else is happening in that field and how sort of nutrient status, moisture, and all of those factors are there.
And also,
sorry, to add to that, the bigger issue I'd find with that is that what have I done to lamb performance by making them eat to 3 centimetres? So you have affected recovery rate of grass, but you've also probably affected lamb performance.
Thanks, Liz. And do you know, are there any problems rotationally grazing red clover lays?
So the challenge, well, Red clover can be grazed very successfully. The challenge we've got generally with it is the risk of bloat in animals that are unaccustomed to grazing like high legume diets. So they can be rotationally grazed. The animals that are selected need to be sort of introduced to that diet quite gradually, so over a period of a couple of weeks, by potentially bringing in by allowing them run back almost to grass as well as having some red clover. If they're already used to sort of high white clover diets, that transition can be shortened a bit. In terms of red clover, you're also going to be slightly grazing at higher sort of centered, higher sward heights. It's a different type of plant to grass, and you're not probably going to be asking them to graze too tightly, because there is a risk of, as it grows off a taproot, this animal grazes it too low, similar to if you cut it for silage too low, there's a risk of killing out that taproot and killing the plant off. So it can be done quite successfully, but would need to be during, as mentioned, the rotation would have to be rotationally grazed to give it a chance to recover before it's moved on. But yeah, the biggest risks would be a bloat type, which can be managed to a degree, but also would have to be monitored for. But yeah, certainly on there's nothing that from a forage perspective, there's nothing that grows lambs quicker than a red clover, and more people are now starting to graze it with beef cattle. But that transition period is really, really fundamental. So ensuring there's fibre available, there's water available, and they're not turned on hungry, and they're never allowed to get hungry is really important.
Thanks, Liz. Do you have any advice in rotationally grazing non-ryegrass native meadows?
So what we have to remember is that I was a little biased towards ryegrass earlier, but all grasses have an ability to have high energy sort of leaf, in terms of green leaf. So what we're always trying to do is trying to maintain or maximize the amount of green leaf that those animals are being exposed to, if you want them to graze or to grow well. So non-ryegrass swards or native species can do a really good job. They just don't tend to have the growth rates you see in ryegrass, and the quality might be slightly reduced. But if you're grazing green leafy material, then performance will be maximised on those types of swards. The challenge you tend to have with those sort of swards is they tend to run to seed at shorter heights, tend to be stressed out quicker, depending on temperature. So they can lose quality sooner. But then I know a lot of people who have used rotational grazing systems as a way to actually improve into improve permanent pasture, because you're putting you're concentrating the nutrient return onto those fields. The sort of grazing action of taking them down low and allowing them to recover also sort of selects the grasses within those systems that do well under that system. So the two factors that affect sward composition would be nutrients and grazing management. So you can have a really positive impact on those types of swards. And I'm not saying they will become ryegrass dominant swards. I'm just saying that you will change the nature of some of those swards into their grazing ability by rotationally grazing them, and in time, and could be within as quick as a season, depending on what is their starting nutrient status, you will see those swards transform into a more sort of grazing based sward.
Thanks, Liz. And when a paddock does go to seed, say late May, early June, how headed does it need to be to make it worthwhile resetting it with the mower?
I think there's some debate about the fact is that if that's topped, and I shouldn't use the word topped, mowed, so to about 4 centimetres prior to the longest day, there is some benefit and some recovery of that grass. So then it can be worthwhile, but we're talking about a serious amount. So it's not just wispy bits that are just annoying. It is a serious amount of heads. If you're sort of after the longest day, then I think it starts to be less useful to reset it, because basically the plant has sort of the ability or the desire for that plant to go to seed is driven by day length. So obviously, as you go past the longest day, even if you reset that plant down to 4 centimetres, it's sort of in its sort of natural decline until you get back into the autumn. So you're not necessarily going to get a boost of grass growth post that period. You might, if you've got other plants in that sward, you might see some advantage of improving the quality of them by sort of topping them and starting again. Quite a lot of it's aesthetic, as it makes it look better. And then I suppose there's other sort of, as sort of talked about earlier, there's other strategies that you can do for fields that do that. So you've lost quality on one field, so you tighten up other fields, and then you come back to that field as either by strip grazing it with sheep or do something else later in the year to tidy it back up. But back to that thing is, if you want to top it, crack on top it. It may do nothing at all apart from make you feel better. But it's something to do. There's definitely something around that longest day where you will have some benefit in terms of future grass growth if you do it early enough.
Thanks, Liz. Just 2 more questions, then we'll be out of time. Are the statistics on Grass Check GB based on specific grass types, or is it a mixture of reseeded and old permanent pastures?
It is a mixture on those farms. So the farms that are involved aren't necessarily recording all of their grass fields. They are generally recording one rotation, a minimum of one rotation on their farm. It's probably representing more improved pasture than you would see across all beef and sheep farms, but also the caveat is that these farms have to be rotationally grazing from early spring. So they will be tending to be farms that have more improved swards anyway. But certainly some of those grass growth information would be from permanent pastures. But it's grass growth performance under rotational grazing systems that's really being captured. So it will be probably, or will be higher than grass growth that you'd expect on set stocked or continuously grazed permanent pasture.
Thank you. And finally, this person would like your comments. They say that extending the grazing system at both ends, planning for this in terms of requirements against pasture growth is relatively complex, especially when you consider interactions with the environment. Do you have any comments on this?
So I think, yeah, it's, as I do very often, it's really easy to talk about grazing systems when you sit in somewhere, and actually to manage them is quite complex, back to that point of when grass grows not necessarily when we want it to, and it doesn't particularly grow in the winter. So it is about, there has to be an element of monitoring within that, and it is also important to, yes, you can definitely write a grazing plan, and it is quite complex, but there's also an element of having to monitor that against what's actually happening and ensuring you have a plan B, and that could be silage or hay, or it could be moving some of those animals off that farm. I don't think there's many people that have started the year going, well, we're going to do this, and by the end of the year they're doing exactly what they thought they were going to do. So grazing systems has to have flexibility within them. And so if you see the more sort of the flexible you are in terms of being able to sell or buy in stock, generally the more able you are to deal with these sort of fluxes in grass growth. And certainly some of the more tricky ones to sort of manage are the ones that have really high demand all the way through the winter because they're retaining lambs for later, or they're retaining quite a high number of replacements, or they've got a lot of cattle in the system. So it's also having to think about, can you change what your demand line looks like to better match your growth rate? And so I've done quite a lot of work previously with Farmax or other models like that, which sort of help people think about it as a sort of a system approach, and then to try and have an understanding of what the demand is going to be like during the winter and how could we change that to sort of fit with grass growth a bit better. But generally, the more system, the better the system fits with grass growth curve, the more profitable it is. So it is really important to think about how you're lambing, calving, numbers of animals you have over the winter, and how that's going to affect it. So there's a bit about changing the system rather than constantly fighting grass growth, because it's never going to do exactly what we want to do all of the time.
Thanks, Liz. We've come to the end of the questions, so thank you very much for that brilliant presentation, and thank you for everybody at home for listening. Just a reminder again that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel within the next few days, and a link will also be emailed out to you within the next few days too, should you wish to recap on anything. So thanks again, and have a good evening, everybody.